Nothing cuts deeper than being invisible to the one person who should see you most. For Freydis Alvhedr, her wedding day was supposed to mark a new beginning, but instead she found herself forgotten at her own feast. Torgrim Hauksson was a giant among men, feared in battle, loved by his warriors, and celebrated throughout the northlands. On their wedding night, he raised his drinking horn high, telling grand tales of raids and victories to his cheering shield brothers. But he never once looked at his new bride sitting beside him. Freydis watched quietly as her husband treated her like an afterthought, just another piece moved on the board by clan elders. She had been patient long enough. When she finally stood and lifted her own cup, it was not to toast their union. What she said next would change everything between them. What words could silence an entire hall of hardened Vikings? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The settlement of Skarnholt sat like a weathered crown upon the rugged coastline, its timber halls and stone foundations carved from the very bones of the earth. Here, where the North Sea crashed against granite cliffs and pine forests stretched endlessly inland, the clan of Hauksson had thrived for 7 generations. The great hall stood at the settlement's heart, its roof beams hewn from ancient oaks, and its walls adorned with shields that had seen countless battles. Smoke rose perpetually from its central hearth, a beacon that could be seen from the fishing boats returning home with their daily catch. On this particular autumn evening, as the first frost touched the ground and the air carried the scent of burning wood and roasted meat, Skarnholt prepared for a celebration that would be remembered for generations to come. The marriage of Torgrim Hauksson to Freydis Alvhedr was not merely the union of 2 people, it was the joining of 2 once powerful clans, a strategic alliance that the elders had negotiated with the careful precision of master craftsmen. Torgrim Hauksson commanded attention simply by existing. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to carry the world's burdens, he moved through life like a force of nature. His red-gold beard, braided with silver rings earned in battle, caught the firelight as he laughed, and Torgrim laughed often and loudly. His voice could boom across a fjord on a still morning, and his presence alone could settle disputes that might otherwise end in bloodshed. Warriors who had never bent the knee to any man would defer to Torgrim not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for his prowess and his fairness. The scars that marked his arms and hands told stories of 32 battles, 7 raids along the English coast, and countless smaller skirmishes that had made him a legend before his 35th year. But perhaps more impressive than his skill with sword and axe was his ability to inspire loyalty. Men would follow Torgrim into the mouth of Jormungandr itself, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned their trust through years of sharing both victory and hardship. Yet for all his strengths as a warrior and leader, Torgrim possessed a blind spot that had troubled the settlement's wise women for years. When it came to matters of the heart, to the subtle currents that flowed between people in quiet moments, he moved with all the grace of a bull in a pottery shop. He understood brotherhood, loyalty, and honor, but the deeper mysteries of companionship, the kind that sustained couples through long winters and longer years, remained as foreign to him as the customs of distant lands. Freydis Alvhedr represented everything that Torgrim failed to comprehend about true strength. Where he was loud, she was thoughtful. Where he dominated conversations, she listened with the intensity of someone who understood that wisdom often came wrapped in whispers. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, like dawn breaking over a mountain peak. Her dark hair, when unbound, fell past her waist like a cascade of midnight water, and her green eyes held depths that suggested currents running far beneath the surface. But Freydis was far more than her appearance suggested. She was the daughter of Jarl Alvhedr the Wise, a man whose counsel had once been sought by kings, and whose library of carved runestones had been the envy of learned men across the northlands. When plague had taken her father 3 winters past, it had also taken with it much of her clan's political influence. The Alvhedr lands, once prosperous and well defended, had gradually been absorbed by stronger neighbors. Freydis found herself in the position of countless women before her, a valuable marriage prospect whose worth was measured not by her own considerable abilities, but by the alliances her union might forge. The silver arm ring that encircled her left wrist told the true story of her heritage. Engraved with intricate knotwork and inlaid with amber from the Baltic shores, it had been her father's final gift to her. The patterns traced the lineage of the Alvhedr clan back through 12 generations, each twist and turn of the design representing another ancestor who had shaped the destiny of their people. When the firelight caught the silver just right, the amber seemed to glow with its own inner warmth, as if the spirits of her forebears were offering their silent support. Those who knew Freydis well understood that she possessed her father's gift for strategy and his deep understanding of human nature. She could read the currents of political tension in a room as easily as a sailor reads the wind, and her counsel, when sought, proved invariably sound. During the hard winter 2 years past, when food stores ran low and tempers ran high, it had been Freydis who suggested the hunting parties that prevented starvation. When the merchant ships from the southern lands had tried to cheat the settlement on grain prices, she had devised the counter-proposal that left everyone satisfied. Yet these contributions went largely unnoticed, attributed to luck or feminine intuition, rather than the keen intelligence that actually guided them. In a world where worth was often measured by the strength of one's sword arm or the volume of one's voice, Freydis found herself consistently undervalued despite possessing skills that any wise leader would treasure. The marriage negotiations had begun in early spring, when the elders of both clans recognized the mutual benefits such a union could provide. Torgrim needed a wife who could bring legitimacy and political connections to strengthen his position as Jarl. Freydis needed protection for what remained of her people and her lands. On parchment, it seemed a perfect match, two respected bloodlines joining forces to create something stronger than either could achieve alone. But the negotiations had been conducted entirely between the men, with Freydis and Torgrim barely exchanging a dozen words before their fate was sealed. The few conversations they had shared revealed a troubling pattern. Torgrim spoke to her with the same polite distance he might show to any well-born visitor, asking about her health, the weather, or other pleasantries that meant nothing and revealed less. He seemed genuinely unaware that she might have thoughts worth hearing or opinions worth considering. For her part, Freydis had tried to bridge the gap between them. She had asked about his travels, his experiences in battle, his thoughts on leadership. But Torgrim's responses, while not unkind, suggested a man who saw her questions as mere curiosity rather than genuine interest in understanding the person she was soon to spend her life beside. He answered her politely but briefly, then inevitably turned the conversation toward his shield brothers, or some upcoming expedition. The supporting characters who populated their world reflected the complex social dynamics of their time. Gunnar Ironside, Torgrim's closest friend and battle companion, was a man whose loyalty ran deeper than blood. He had saved Torgrim's life during their first raid together, and the bond forged in that moment had never weakened. Gunnar possessed the rare ability to speak honestly to Torgrim without giving offense. But even he seemed blind to his friend's shortcomings as a husband. Astrid the healer served as the settlement's wise woman, keeper of herb lore and birth secrets. She had delivered half the babies in Skarnholt and tended wounds that would have killed lesser men. Astrid saw clearly what others missed, the growing sadness in Freydis's eyes as her wedding day approached, the way the young woman's shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. But wisdom and observation were not always welcome gifts, and Astrid knew better than to speak unbidden about matters of the heart. Elder Bjorn Greybeard had negotiated the marriage terms with the careful precision of a master craftsman. At 73, he had seen enough unions to know that strategic marriages could succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically, depending on factors that no amount of planning could control. He genuinely believed he had arranged a beneficial match, but his focus on lands, dowries, and political alliances had left little room for considering whether the two people involved might actually find happiness. Together, the serving women who prepared the wedding feast whispered among themselves about the coming union. Some spoke hopefully of the children that might come from such a match, strong sons who would carry their father's warrior spirit and their mother's wisdom. Others worried quietly that Freydis seemed more resigned than joyful as her wedding day approached. But serving women learned early to keep their observations to themselves, especially when those observations concerned their betters. As the wedding preparations intensified, the contrast between the couple became increasingly apparent. Torgrim threw himself into the festivities with his characteristic enthusiasm, overseeing the preparation of mead, organizing competitions among his warriors, and ensuring that every guest would have cause to remember the celebration. His joy was genuine, but seemed entirely focused on the event itself, rather than the woman who would become his wife. Freydis, meanwhile, prepared with the quiet dignity that marked all her actions. She oversaw the weaving of her wedding dress, a masterpiece of blue wool decorated with silver threads that caught the light like captured starlight. She arranged for the preparation of special dishes that would honor both their family traditions. She conducted herself in all things as befitted a woman of her station, but those who looked closely could see that her smiles never quite reached her eyes. The final days before the wedding saw Skarnholt transformed into a festival ground. Guests arrived from settlements along the coast, bringing gifts, stories, and appetites worthy of the celebration. The great hall was decorated with the finest tapestries, tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, and the air hummed with anticipation. Everything was prepared for a celebration that would mark not just the union of two people, but the birth of a new chapter in the history of their clans. Yet beneath all the preparation and excitement, a careful observer might have noticed the way Torgrim and Freydis moved around each other like polite strangers, the way their conversations never strayed beyond the purely practical, the way they seemed to exist in separate worlds, even when standing side by side. The stage was set for either a triumph or a tragedy, and the only question remaining was which direction the currents of fate would carry them. The wedding ceremony began at sunset, when the dying light painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to mirror the flames dancing in the great hall's hearth. The ritual itself followed traditions as old as the settlement itself, vows spoken before the sacred hammer, rings exchanged over the ancestral sword, and the binding of hands with cord woven from threads representing both their bloodlines. Freydis spoke her promises clearly, her voice carrying across the hushed assembly. Torgrim's responses boomed with characteristic confidence, each word reaching even those gathered outside the hall. When the ceremony concluded and the feasting began, the transformation from solemn ritual to joyous celebration happened with the speed of a breaking wave. The carved raven bowl, a ceremonial vessel passed down through 5 generations of Hauksson jarls, was filled with the finest mead and passed from guest to guest. Each person who drank from it offered words of blessing for the newly married couple before passing it along. The bowl itself was a masterwork of craftsmanship, its dark wood polished to a mirror shine and carved with intricate ravens, whose wings seemed to move in the flickering firelight. Torgrim accepted the bowl when it reached him, draining it deeply before rising to address the assembled guests. His voice, already rich with mead and celebration, filled every corner of the hall as he began to regale the company with tales of his recent exploits. The assembled warriors leaned forward, eager to hear again the story of how their jarl had single-handedly held a bridge against 12 Danish berserkers, or how he had outmaneuvered 3 longships to claim the treasure they now saw displayed on the hall's walls. As the evening progressed, Torgrim's storytelling grew more animated and his laughter more frequent. He moved among his guests with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in his world, sharing jokes with old companions, arm-wrestling challengers half his age, and drinking toasts to victories both past and future. His shield brothers gathered around him like iron filings drawn to a lodestone, each man eager to bask in the warmth of their leader's attention and approval. Meanwhile, Freydis remained at the high table, fulfilling her role as hostess with quiet grace. She ensured that no guest's cup remained empty, that the serving women knew which dishes to prioritize, and that the elderly guests were seated comfortably away from the coldest draughts. When wives of visiting jarls approached to offer their congratulations, she received their words with genuine warmth and asked thoughtful questions about their journeys and their families. But as the hours passed and the celebration grew more boisterous, the distance between husband and wife became increasingly apparent. Torgrim, swept up in the joy of entertaining his guests, seemed to forget entirely that this was his wedding feast. He spoke as if he were hosting a victory celebration after a successful raid, all swagger and battlefield camaraderie. When Gunnar Ironside raised his horn to toast the finest warrior in all the northlands, Torgrim basked in the praise without any apparent awareness that his bride sat just arm's length away, listening to herself be completely ignored in the celebration of their own marriage. The moment that would change everything began quietly, as pivotal moments often do. Freydis had been watching a group of women near the far wall, wives and daughters of Torgrim's warriors, as they whispered among themselves. Their glances kept shifting between her and her husband, and while their expressions held no malice, the pity she saw there cut deeper than any blade. One woman, perhaps emboldened by mead, actually shook her head sadly as she watched Torgrim launch into yet another tale of his prowess, while completely ignoring his new wife. That gesture, that small shake of the head, from a woman whose name Freydis didn't even know, crystallized something that had been building within her all evening. She looked around the hall and saw clearly how the evening appeared to everyone present. Her husband was performing for his audience like a scold hired for entertainment, while she sat beside him like a beautiful but meaningless decoration. The message being sent to every person in that hall was unmistakable. Freydis Alvhedr might now bear the name Hauksson, but she would never truly matter to the man who carried it. The Raven Bowl had made another circuit of the hall and found its way back to the high table. This time, instead of passing it to Torgrim, the warrior who brought it offered it first to Freydis. It was a gesture of respect that her husband had failed to show all evening, and it provided her with the perfect opportunity to do what her heart had been demanding for hours. Freydis accepted the bowl with steady hands, feeling the weight of its carved wood and the warmth of the mead within. She could feel the subtle shift in attention as nearby guests noticed that she was about to speak. Traditionally, brides were expected to offer a brief, modest toast, thanking the guests for their presence and blessing their new union. What Freydis had in mind was something altogether different. She rose slowly, gracefully, the carved raven bowl held before her like an offering to the gods themselves. The movement caught the attention of those nearest the high table, and gradually the conversations around her began to fade. Torgrim, in the middle of describing his favorite battle axe, noticed the growing quiet and turned to see his wife standing beside him with an expression he had never seen before. When Freydis spoke, her voice carried the clear, strong tones that her father had used when addressing assemblies of jarls and kings. There was no tremor of uncertainty, no apologetic softness. Instead, her words rang out with the authority of someone who knew exactly what she intended to say and why it needed saying. "My friends and honored guests," she began, and already the tone was different from what anyone expected. "I stand before you tonight, not just as a new bride, but as the daughter of Jarl Alvhedr the Wise, whose counsel once guided kings and whose wisdom shaped the destiny of our people." The hall had grown completely still now, every conversation dying as her words reached even the farthest corners. Torgrim stood frozen beside her, his drinking horn half raised, clearly uncertain what was happening, but beginning to sense that it was not what he had anticipated. Freydis continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Many of you remember my father, though some may have forgotten the debt of gratitude you owe to his memory. When the plague threatened to destroy our neighboring settlements 5 winters past, it was Alvhedr who devised the quarantine measures that saved hundreds of lives. When the Danish fleet threatened our shores, it was his strategic planning that allowed our forces to drive them back to sea. And when disputes arose between clans that might have led to bloodshed, it was his wisdom that found paths to peace. She paused, letting those words settle in the minds of her listeners, many of whom were indeed remembering debts they had forgotten and counsel they had undervalued. Then her gaze shifted to her husband, and her voice took on a different quality entirely. I am his daughter, in more than blood alone. When food stores ran low 2 winters past, whose suggestion led to the hunting parties that kept our people fed? When the southern merchants tried to cheat us on grain prices, whose plan secured fair terms for all? These contributions may have been overlooked or attributed to others, but they came from the same mind that learned strategy at Alvhedr's knee. The implications of her words were becoming clear to everyone present. This was not a traditional wedding toast. This was a woman asserting her worth and demanding recognition. But Freydis was far from finished. Tonight, as I sit beside my new husband, I have listened to tale after tale of his mighty deeds. And they are mighty indeed. Torgrim Hauksson's courage and strength are legendary, and rightly so. But I have also listened to him speak as if he conquered his battles alone, as if strength of arm is the only virtue worth celebrating, as if the woman who now shares his name and his future is invisible even at her own wedding feast. The silence in the hall was now absolute. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted, as if the flames themselves were listening. Torgrim's face had gone through several shades of red, though whether from embarrassment, anger, or simple shock was impossible to determine. Freydis raised the carved raven bowl higher, her final words carrying the weight of a decree. I drink tonight not to a union of convenience, but to the hope that my husband might one day see that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from recognizing the worth of those who stand beside you. May he learn that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when 2 people choose to truly see each other. She drained the bowl completely, set it down with a soft thud that seemed to echo like thunder, and resumed her seat. The hall remained frozen in absolute silence, every eye moving between the woman who had just redefined her place in their world and the giant warrior who sat beside her. Apparently speechless for the first time in his life, the silence that followed Freydis's words stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. In that frozen moment, the carved bone dice that had been rattling in a corner game seemed to echo like thunder as they hit the wooden table. Every breath, every subtle shift of weight, every small movement became magnified in the absolute stillness that gripped the great hall. Torgrim's drinking horn remained suspended halfway to his lips, his blue eyes fixed on his wife with an expression that cycled through confusion, shock, and something that might have been the dawning recognition of a truth he had never considered. The giant warrior who had faced berserker charges without flinching found himself completely unprepared for this moment of reckoning delivered by the woman sitting beside him. Gunnar Ironside was the first to break the spell, though his movement was tentative and uncertain. He set down his own drinking horn with exaggerated care, as if any sudden motion might shatter whatever delicate balance now existed in the room. His eyes moved between his oldest friend and the woman who had just challenged everything Torgrim thought he understood about marriage, leadership, and respect. Elder Bjorn Greybeard stroked his long whiskers with trembling fingers, his weathered face reflecting the complex calculations of a man trying to determine whether the evening's events represented disaster or opportunity. As the architect of this marriage alliance, he bore responsibility for whatever came next, and the political implications of Freydis's public challenge were still unfolding in his mind. Astrid the healer, positioned near the wall where she could observe without intruding, allowed herself the smallest smile of satisfaction. She had seen this moment building for weeks, watching Freydis struggle with an impossible situation, while Torgrim remained oblivious to everything except his own assumptions. The wise woman understood that some wounds required cutting before they could heal properly. The carved bone dice, sitting on their game table, seemed almost alive in the firelight, their surfaces showing various combinations of dots and runes that suggested fate itself was rolling new possibilities into existence. These dice had seen countless games played out in the hall, witnessed victories and defeats that shaped the destinies of warriors and their families. Tonight, they had become silent witnesses to a different kind of gamble entirely. It was Torgrim who finally moved, setting his drinking horn down with a hollow thud that seemed to release everyone else from their frozen state. He turned in his chair to face Freydis fully, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual booming confidence. Instead, it held the careful tone of a man navigating completely unfamiliar territory. "You speak of being overlooked," he said slowly, each word chosen with unusual deliberation. "But tonight was meant to celebrate our union. These tales I told, they were meant to honor our marriage by sharing the victories that brought us to this moment." Freydis met his gaze steadily, her green eyes reflecting the firelight like still water under starlight. "And yet in all your tales of victory, husband, you spoke of every warrior who stood beside you, every strategy that led to triumph, every detail of blade and blood. But you never once mentioned that this was the night you gained a partner for life, or that the woman sitting beside you might be worth acknowledging in your moment of celebration." The words were delivered without heat or accusation, simply as observations that cut precisely because of their accuracy. Around the hall, conversations began to resume in hushed tones as guests processed what they had witnessed and tried to determine the appropriate response to such an unprecedented situation. Some of the older women nodded approvingly, recognizing in Freydis's actions the kind of courage they wished they had possessed in their own youth. The warriors looked uncertain, torn between loyalty to their jarl and grudging respect for a woman who had displayed the kind of fearless honesty that they prized in battle companions. The younger, unmarried men and women watched with fascination, sensing that they were witnessing something that would influence their own future relationships. Torgrim's massive hands, which had wielded sword and axe with deadly precision through countless battles, now fidgeted with the edge of his tunic as he struggled to formulate a response. The man who could inspire loyalty through decisive action found himself paralyzed by the complexity of emotions he had never learned to navigate. "I meant no disrespect," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him considerable effort. "The fault lies in my understanding, not in your worth. Perhaps—" He paused, the words clearly difficult for someone unaccustomed to acknowledging uncertainty. "Perhaps I have been so long focused on the duties of leadership that I have forgotten the responsibilities of partnership." It was not an apology, exactly, but it was closer to one than anyone in the hall had ever heard from Torgrim Hauksson. The concession rippled through the gathered guests like stones dropped into still water, creating waves of reaction that would spread far beyond this single evening. Freydis considered his words carefully before responding, her expression softening slightly, though her posture remained alert and dignified. "Understanding can be learned, husband, if the desire for it is genuine, but it requires seeing those around you as more than simply extensions of your own will and purpose." She gestured gracefully toward the assembled guests, her movement encompassing the entire hall. "Every person here tonight has their own stories, their own wisdom, their own contributions to our community. The wives who manage households while their husbands sail to war, the craftsmen who forge the weapons that win your battles, the farmers whose labor feeds our people through long winters. Strength comes in many forms, and leadership means recognizing all of them." Her words carried implications that extended far beyond their marriage, touching on questions of governance and community that would resonate with everyone present. Several of the jarls and their wives exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing wisdom that could benefit their own relationships and leadership challenges. Gunnar Ironside cleared his throat carefully, sensing an opportunity to help his friend navigate these treacherous waters. "The lady speaks truth that we would all do well to remember," he said, raising his drinking horn in a gesture that was part toast, part peace offering. "To wisdom in all its forms, and to partnerships built on recognition rather than assumption, the toast provided a path forward that allowed the celebration to continue while acknowledging the fundamental shift that had just occurred. One by one, the guests raised their own cups and horns, drinking to a sentiment that felt both diplomatic and genuine. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the hall underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. Conversations became more inclusive, with wives and daughters finding themselves asked for opinions that might previously have been dismissed. Torgrim, still clearly struggling with the new dynamic, made visible efforts to include Freydis in discussions and to acknowledge her presence when addressing their guests. But the changes were tentative and awkward, like a warrior learning to fight with his offhand. Every interaction carried the weight of uncertainty, every exchange the potential for misunderstanding. The dice on their table seemed to mock the participants with their random patterns, suggesting that the outcome of this evening's events remained very much in doubt. As the feast began to wind down and guests started preparing for departure or sleep, Freydis found herself surrounded by women who approached with carefully worded compliments and questions. Some sought advice about their own marriages, others simply wanted to express admiration for her courage. Through it all, she remained gracious but guarded, knowing that her actions tonight had changed her position in ways that were still unfolding. The carved bone dice caught the dying firelight one last time as the evening drew to a close, their surfaces reflecting possibilities that neither husband nor wife could yet fully comprehend. The morning after the wedding feast dawned grey and cold, with frost covering the settlement like a silver shroud. In the Jarl's private chambers, Torgrim sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. The events of the previous evening replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity, each memory highlighting details he had missed in the moment. The way Freydis had sat so still and dignified while he regaled his guests with tales, the expressions on the faces around them, the terrible silence that had followed her words. Freydis moved about the chamber with quiet efficiency, tending to the morning fire and preparing for the day ahead. Her wedding dress had been carefully folded and stored away, replaced by a practical wool gown in deep blue that emphasized her grace without ostentation. On her wrist, the silver arm ring caught the pale morning light, its amber inlays seeming to glow with inner warmth, a reminder of the heritage and strength that Torgrim had failed to recognize. The iron key that hung from her belt represented her new authority as mistress of the household, but it felt heavier than its actual weight suggested. This key would unlock storerooms and treasuries, giving her control over resources that could feed the settlement through winter or fund expeditions to distant shores. Yet the real challenge lay not in managing goods and silver, but in finding a way to unlock the understanding between herself and her husband. Their first conversation as a married couple came when Torgrim finally broke the silence that had stretched between them since they had retired the night before. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, carried an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. "I have been thinking about your words," he said, not looking directly at her. "About being overlooked. I did not realize—" He stopped, struggling with concepts that had no place in his experience of battle and brotherhood. "Help me understand what I should have done differently." Freydis paused in her work, considering how to respond to this unexpected request. The very fact that he was asking represented progress, but she could see that his confusion was genuine rather than feigned. Torgrim possessed the kind of intelligence that excelled at military strategy and resource management, but the subtle dynamics of personal relationships remained largely mysterious to him. "Last night, when you told the story of the bridge battle with the Danish berserkers," she said carefully, You spoke of how Gunnar covered your left flank, how young Eric's quick thinking saved the day, how even old Harold contributed by managing the retreat route. You saw every man's contribution clearly and honored it in your telling. Torgrim nodded, still not understanding where her observation was leading. But when you spoke of our marriage, you treated it as if it were your achievement alone, as if I was simply another prize won through your prowess, rather than a person who chose to bind her fate to yours and brings her own strengths to our union. The explanation seemed to penetrate something in Torgrim's understanding, though his expression suggested he was grappling with ideas that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. He had been raised to see marriage as a transaction between families, a strategic alliance that secured bloodlines and property rights. The notion that his wife might be a true partner, with wisdom and contributions equal to his own, was as foreign to him as the customs of distant lands. In battle, he said slowly, working through the comparison, I succeed because I recognize what each warrior brings to the fight. You are saying I should do the same in marriage. I am saying that marriage is not something you win, husband. It is something you build together every day. Just as you would not ignore Gunnar's counsel before a raid, you should not ignore the insights of the woman who shares your bed and your future. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the chamber door. Gunnar Ironside entered at Torgrim's invitation, but his usual easy familiarity was tempered by obvious uncertainty about how to navigate the changed dynamic between his friend and his friend's new wife. The morning patrol has returned, Gunnar reported, but his eyes kept shifting between Torgrim and Freydis as if trying to gauge the temperature of their relationship. No signs of raiders along the northern approaches, but Olsson's farm reports wolves troubling their livestock again. Torgrim rose immediately, his mind shifting into the familiar patterns of leadership and problem-solving. We will need to organize hunting parties. The pack must be dealt with before they grow bolder. He moved toward his weapons rack, already planning the expedition in his head. Freydis cleared her throat softly, a sound that somehow managed to capture both men's attention without seeming demanding or intrusive. Before you commit warriors to a wolf hunt, husband, perhaps we should consider why the pack has moved so close to settled lands. Wolves are cautious creatures. They do not usually risk human contact unless driven by desperation or opportunity. Torgrim paused, his hand halfway to his favorite spear. What do you mean? The harvest reports from the northern farms have been concerning, she continued, her voice taking on the analytical tone that had marked her father's counsel. Poor yields, failed crops in several areas. If the usual prey animals have moved elsewhere in search of better foraging, the wolves would follow. Hunting the pack might solve the immediate problem, but it will not address the underlying cause. Gunnar's eyebrows rose appreciatively. He possessed enough military experience to recognize sound, strategic thinking when he heard it, regardless of its source. You think there are larger issues at play? I think we should investigate before we act, Freydis replied. Send scouts to assess the wildlife patterns in the northern reaches. Check with the hunters about recent changes in deer and elk movements. If the ecosystem has been disrupted, killing a few wolves will not restore the balance. The suggestion displayed exactly the kind of long-term thinking that separated good leaders from merely adequate ones. Torgrim found himself grudgingly impressed, despite his instinctive resistance to having his decisions questioned. More troubling was the realization that he had been about to commit significant resources to a solution that might prove both temporary and inadequate. You propose we delay action while wolves threaten our people? He asked, but the question carried more curiosity than challenge. I propose we take intelligent action rather than simply dramatic action, she replied evenly. Send a small force to protect Olsson's livestock immediately, but gather information before committing to a larger campaign. Understanding the problem completely will lead to solutions that last. The iron key at her belt caught the light again as she moved, and Torgrim found himself staring at it with new understanding. The key represented more than domestic authority. It symbolized the trust and responsibility that came with true partnership. For the first time, he began to glimpse what his marriage could become if he learned to see his wife as something more than a beautiful ornament to his achievements. Gunnar watched this exchange with growing fascination, recognizing that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his long friendship with Torgrim. Never before had he seen his friend actually consider modifying a military decision based on someone else's counsel, let alone counsel from a woman. The implications of this change extended far beyond their immediate wolf problem. "We will do as my wife suggests," Torgrim said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth, but somehow right nonetheless. "Send protection to the farms immediately, but also send scouts to investigate the larger patterns. Wisdom lies in understanding our enemies, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. It was a small step, but both Freydis and Gunnar recognized its significance. For the first time in his adult life, Torgrim Hauksson had publicly acknowledged that someone else's strategic thinking might be superior to his own initial impulses. 3 weeks after the wedding, the first real test of Torgrim and Freydis's evolving partnership arrived in the form of a weathered messenger who brought news that would challenge everything. They thought they understood about their future together. The man had ridden hard from the southern settlements, his horse foam-flecked and his face grim with the weight of the information he carried. The ivory chess set that had belonged to Freydis's father sat on a small table in the corner of the great hall, its pieces carved with exquisite detail that reflected both the artisan's skill and the original owner's appreciation for strategic thinking. The White King bore the face of a wise ruler, while the Black Queen commanded her forces with regal authority. This chess set had been Jarl Alvhedr's most prized possession, a gift from a Byzantine merchant who had recognized the Northmen's intellectual gifts. Now it served as a reminder of the complex games of strategy and politics that shaped the fate of settlements and clans. Freydis had been using the chess set to teach some of the settlement's children the fundamentals of strategic thinking when the messenger arrived. Young Bjorn, grandson of the elder, had shown particular aptitude for seeing multiple moves ahead, while little Astrid, named for the healer, preferred bold, aggressive attacks that sometimes succeeded through sheer audacity. Watching them learn reminded Freydis of her own childhood lessons with her father, when she had first begun to understand that true power came not from strength alone, but from the ability to anticipate consequences and plan for multiple possibilities. The messenger's news shattered the morning's peaceful routine like a stone through ice. King Magnus of the Southern Territories had died suddenly, leaving behind a succession crisis that threatened to destabilize the entire region. 3 different claimants were already gathering supporters, and each would soon be seeking allies among the northern jarls. The choice of which claimant to support, or whether to remain neutral, would have consequences that could echo through generations. Torgrim received the news with the grim focus of a warrior assessing battlefield conditions. His immediate instinct was to gather his most trusted advisors and begin analyzing the military implications of each possible alliance. Which claimant offered the best terms for mutual defense? Which had the strongest war bands? Which posed the greatest threat if left unopposed? But as he began to summon his war council, he found himself hesitating, and that hesitation surprised him more than the news itself. 3 weeks of tentative partnership with Freydis had begun to change his thinking in subtle but significant ways. Instead of making immediate decisions based on his first assessment, he found himself wondering what perspectives he might be missing. "Before we counsel," he said to Gunnar, who'd been preparing to send for the other senior warriors, "I would hear my wife's thoughts on this matter." The request was unprecedented, and Gunnar's surprise showed clearly on his weathered face. In all their years of friendship, Torgrim had never sought anyone's counsel before forming his own initial opinions, let alone a woman's perspective on matters of war and politics. But something in his friend's tone suggested this was not a casual whim. "Freydis," set aside the chess lesson and approached the messenger with questions that revealed both her political acumen and her understanding of the larger forces at play. She asked not just about the claimants' military strength, but about their policies toward trade, their relationships with neighboring kingdoms, and their likely approaches to governing the territories they sought to control. "Tell me about Magnus's death," she said, her voice carrying the same analytical tone her father had used when gathering intelligence. "Was it sudden enough to be suspicious? Who benefits most from the timing? And which of the claimants was closest to the king when he died?" The messenger, a grizzled veteran who had carried news between settlements for 2 decades, found himself impressed by the depth of her questions. Most jarls wanted to know only about armies and alliances. This woman was asking about motivations, opportunities, and the subtle currents of palace politics that often determined outcomes more than battlefield prowess. "The king took ill after a feast," the messenger reported carefully. "Stomach pains, fever, death within 2 days. Some whisper of poison, but there is no proof. Of the claimants, Prince Eric was at court when his father died. Prince Olaf was leading raids along the eastern borders. Prince Canute was visiting allies in the western territories, building support for his own ambitions." Freydis absorbed this information while moving pieces on her father's chessboard, using the game as a tool for visualizing the political situation. Each piece represented different forces: the claimants, their supporters, the uncommitted jarls who would ultimately determine the outcome. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, setting up scenarios and testing possibilities. "If Magnus was poisoned," she mused, her eyes fixed on the chessboard, "then Prince Eric becomes the most obvious suspect. He had opportunity and would benefit most from his father's sudden death. But that obviousness might also make him innocent. A true poisoner would avoid placing himself under such immediate suspicion." Torgrim watched this analysis with growing fascination. He had never thought to question the circumstances of the king's death beyond its immediate political implications. The possibility that the succession crisis might itself be the result of calculated murder added layers of complexity that his straightforward military mind had not considered. "You think the death was arranged?" he asked. "I think we should not commit ourselves to any alliance until we understand what forces are truly at play," she replied, moving a black knight to threaten the White King's position. "If one of the claimants arranged his father's death, that tells us something important about his character and methods. Supporting a kinslayer, even unknowingly, could bring divine judgment on our people." The chess pieces seemed to take on deeper meaning as she spoke, their carved faces reflecting the complex personalities and motivations of real rulers and warriors. The wise king, the powerful queen, the swift knights, the steadfast rooks, each had their role to play in the greater game. But success required understanding not just their individual strengths, but how they worked together and against each other. Gunnar had been listening to this exchange with increasing attention, recognizing strategic thinking that surpassed anything he had encountered in their usual war councils. "What do you propose?" he asked, addressing Freydis directly for perhaps the first time since her arrival at Skarnholt. "Patience," she replied, moving her queen to a position that controlled the center of the board. "Send our own messengers to gather more information. Learn which jarls are already committed and which remain undecided. Discover what each claimant is offering their supporters and what they are demanding in return. Most importantly, find out who else is asking the same questions we are asking." She looked up from the chessboard to meet both men's eyes directly. In games like this, the winner is often not the strongest player, but the one who understands the game best. "Right now we are playing blind, and that is how intelligent people lose to fools who happen to see one move further ahead." The ivory chess set gleamed in the morning light streaming through the hall's windows, its pieces frozen in their eternal struggle for dominance and survival. Like the political crisis they represented, the game's outcome remained uncertain, dependent on the wisdom and skill of those who moved the pieces. The bronze mirror that had belonged to Torgrim's mother hung on the wall of their private chamber, its polished surface reflecting not just images, but the weight of family history and expectations. The mirror had been crafted by master smiths in the southern lands, its bronze surface treated with techniques that kept it brilliant despite the passing years. Around its edge, runic inscriptions told the story of the Hauksson lineage, each symbol representing another generation that had shaped the clan's destiny. When Torgrim's mother had died in childbirth with his younger brother, who had not survived, this mirror had become one of the few tangible connections to her memory and wisdom. Now, as Freydis stood before it braiding her hair for the day's activities, Torgrim found himself seeing the reflection differently. Instead of simply a beautiful woman preparing for daily tasks, he saw someone whose thoughts moved in patterns he was only beginning to understand. The strategic mind that had analyzed the succession crisis with such clarity operated constantly, processing information and connections that his more direct approach often missed entirely. The past week had brought a steady stream of information from the messengers they had dispatched to gather intelligence about the southern crisis. Each report added new complexity to an already tangled situation, and Freydis had insisted they map out all the relationships and connections before making any commitments. The process had been frustrating for Torgrim, whose inclination was to choose quickly and act decisively, but he was beginning to see the wisdom in her more deliberate approach. Prince Eric has made overtures to Jarl Ragnar of the Eastern Cliffs, Freydis said, reviewing the latest reports as she worked with her hair, offering him control of 3 river crossings and tribute rights from the merchant caravans that use them. It is a generous offer, perhaps too generous. Torgrim, who had been sharpening his favorite sayax, paused in his work. You think the offer suggests weakness? I think it suggests desperation, she replied, securing her braid with a silver clasp. A man confident in his claim would not give away so much valuable territory so early in the contest. Either Eric is less secure than he appears, or he knows something about his rivals that makes him believe he needs overwhelming support to succeed. The bronze mirror reflected her thoughtful expression as she turned to face him directly. There is something else that troubles me about Eric's actions. Remember that he was at court when his father died, which gave him the advantage of immediate action. Yet instead of moving quickly to secure the throne, he has spent the past month courting allies as if he expects a long struggle. Why would he do that unless he knows his claim is vulnerable to challenge? These observations demonstrated exactly the kind of layered thinking that Torgrim was learning to value, even when it contradicted his instincts. His military experience told him that decisive action usually trumped careful planning. But Freydis was showing him situations where patience and analysis could prevent costly mistakes. Their discussion was interrupted by Astrid the healer, who knocked and entered at Freydis's invitation. The older woman carried herself with the quiet authority that came from decades of tending the settlement's sick and injured, and her presence usually meant either medical emergency or important news that required discretion. "My lady," Astrid said, addressing Freydis with the respect that had grown noticeably since the wedding feast confrontation, "I have received word from my sister, who serves in the household of Jarl Magnus of the Iron Hills. She writes that strange visitors have been seen in their lands, men who claim to be merchants, but carry themselves like warriors and ask too many questions about defensive preparations." Freydis exchanged a significant look with Torgrim through the bronze mirror's reflection. They had suspected that the succession crisis might involve more than just competing claims among Magnus's sons, but this suggested the possibility of foreign interference or mercenary involvement. "What manner of questions?" Torgrim asked, his warrior's instincts immediately focusing on the military implications. Numbers of fighting men, locations of weapon stores, the loyalty of subordinate jarls, Astrid replied. Questions that raiders might ask when planning attacks, but these men showed no interest in portable wealth or vulnerable targets. They seemed more concerned with understanding how quickly forces could be mobilized and how strong the defensive alliances were. "Freydis," began moving around the chamber with the restless energy that Torgrim was learning to recognize as a sign that her mind was working through complex possibilities. "Someone is mapping our military capabilities," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of logical deduction. "The question is whether they are working for one of the claimants or for someone else entirely. The Danish kings have been quiet this year," Torgrim mused, following her reasoning. "Too quiet, perhaps. If they saw the succession crisis as an opportunity to expand their influence among the northern jarls, then supporting any of Magnus's sons might put us on the wrong side of a much larger conflict," Freydis finished. "We could find ourselves committed to a civil war just as foreign enemies prepare to exploit our internal divisions." The bronze mirror seemed to capture this moment of shared understanding, reflecting two people who were finally beginning to think as partners rather than strangers bound by political necessity. Torgrim could see his own growing respect for his wife's insights reflected in the polished surface, while Freydis saw a man who was learning to value wisdom over mere strength. Astrid watched this exchange with satisfaction, recognizing the signs of a partnership that was evolving beyond the purely practical. "What would you have me tell my sister?" she asked. "To watch and listen, but to be very careful about who else she shares information with," Freydis replied after a moment's consideration. "And to send word immediately if she sees any signs that these mysterious merchants are moving toward our territories." After Astrid departed, Torgrim and Freydis continued their discussion in the privacy of their chamber. The bronze mirror reflected their movements as they paced and planned. Two minds working together to understand a situation that grew more complex with each piece of new information. "If we are facing the possibility of Danish intervention," Torgrim said slowly, "then our choice of allies becomes even more critical. We need partners who can stand against foreign enemies, not just domestic rivals." Freydis nodded, moving to the window that looked out over Skarnholt's defensive walls. "Which means we need to know not just who is strongest in the current contest, but who is most likely to survive what comes after. The king who wins this succession war may find himself fighting for his life again within a year." The bronze mirror caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, its surface seeming to shimmer with possibilities and uncertainties. Like the political situation they were trying to navigate, the reflection showed reality but also distortion, truth mixed with illusion, clarity that could shift with the slightest change in perspective or lighting. Standing before that mirror, husband and wife began to plan their response to challenges that were becoming more dangerous and complex with each passing day. The arrival of the golden amulet changed everything, though its significance was not immediately apparent to anyone except Freydis. The amulet came in the possession of a Danish merchant who claimed to be fleeing the political chaos in the southern territories, seeking safe passage to the northern settlements where he hoped to wait out the succession war. He was a small, nervous man named Knut who spoke the northern tongue with a heavy accent and carried himself with the hunched shoulders of someone who had survived by avoiding notice rather than commanding it. The amulet itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, depicting a serpent swallowing its own tail in the ancient symbol of eternal return. But what made it truly remarkable was not its artistry, but its provenance. The design was distinctly Danish, yet it bore runic inscriptions that told the story of the northern clan's greatest victory over southern invaders. No legitimate Danish merchant would carry such a piece, which represented both their defeat and their enemy's triumph. Freydis recognized the amulet's significance immediately, though she kept her reaction carefully controlled. She had seen its twin in her father's collection, a war trophy taken from a Danish jarl during the Battle of Ravensfjord 15 years earlier. The existence of a matching piece suggested connections that went far deeper than a simple merchant's desperate flight from political turmoil. "Where did you acquire this piece?" she asked the merchant, her voice carrying casual interest rather than suspicion. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary." Knut's answer came too quickly, with the rehearsed quality of a prepared lie. It was payment for grain shipments to Prince Eric's forces, he said. The prince's treasury masters were short of silver, so they offered goods of equivalent value instead. But Freydis had been studying the reports from their intelligence network, and she knew that Eric's forces were well supplied with conventional currency. More importantly, the amulet's condition suggested it had been carefully preserved for many years, not hastily grabbed from a treasury to pay for grain. The piece showed the kind of wear that came from regular handling by someone who valued it, not the casual damage that might be expected from a mere trade good. That evening, after the merchant had been provided with lodging in the settlement's guest quarters, Freydis shared her suspicions with Torgrim in the privacy of their chamber. The golden amulet lay on their table like a serpent indeed, coiled and dangerous despite its beauty. "This man is not what he appears," she said without preamble. "The amulet he carries is a war trophy, and no Danish merchant would possess such a thing unless he had powerful reasons for doing so." Torgrim examined the piece more carefully, his warrior's eye noting details that had escaped his initial assessment. "You think he is a spy?" "I think he is something worse than a spy," Freydis replied, moving to the bronze mirror and staring at her reflection as if seeking guidance from her own image. "I think he is a messenger, carrying proof of an alliance that could destroy us all." She turned back to face her husband directly, her green eyes reflecting the gravity of her suspicions. "What if the succession crisis is not what it appears? What if it is a carefully orchestrated deception designed to divide the northern jarls, while a Danish invasion force prepares to strike?" The implications of her theory hit Torgrim like a physical blow. If she was correct, then every decision they had been contemplating about supporting various claimants would be playing directly into their enemies' hands. The civil war that seemed inevitable would leave all the northern settlements weakened and vulnerable, ripe for conquest by an enemy who had been planning this campaign for months or even years. "You believe all three claimants are working with the Danes?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "I believe at least one of them is, and possibly more," she replied, picking up the amulet to examine its inscriptions more closely. "Think about what we have learned. Eric moves slowly, despite having early advantages, as if he's waiting for something. Olaf remains on the eastern borders, supposedly fighting raiders, but perhaps actually coordinating with Danish allies. Canute gathers support in the western territories, where Danish ships could land undetected." She set the amulet down with deliberate care, as if it were a poisonous snake that might strike if mishandled. "Each claimant is positioned perfectly to serve Danish interests while appearing to pursue his own ambitions. The civil war serves as both distraction and justification. Who would suspect foreign invasion when internal conflict provides such an obvious explanation for military movements?" Torgrim began to pace the chamber, his mind racing through the strategic implications of Freydis's theory. If she was right, then traditional responses to the succession crisis would be worse than useless. They would be actively harmful. Supporting any claimant might mean supporting Danish agents, while remaining neutral might leave them isolated when the real attack came. "What of the mysterious merchants that Astrid's sister reported?" he asked. "How do they fit this pattern? Advanced scouts, mapping our defenses and measuring our military capabilities," Freydis replied immediately. "But not for any of the claimants, for the Danish fleet that will follow once the civil war has sufficiently weakened our unity." The golden amulet seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as it caught the firelight, its serpent design appearing to writhe in the flickering illumination. The symbol of eternal return took on new meaning in this context. Perhaps the Danes were attempting to reverse their ancient defeat by repeating the same strategy that had nearly succeeded in their grandfather's time. "If your suspicions are correct," Torgrim said slowly, "then we face a choice between impossible alternatives. Support a claimant who may be a Danish puppet, or stand alone against enemies who have been planning this campaign for years." "Not alone," Freydis corrected, moving to stand beside him with the confidence of someone who had already begun planning their response. There will be other Jarls who see through this deception, especially once we share what we have learned. The question is whether we can identify and contact them before the trap closes." She gestured toward the amulet with a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. "Our Danish merchant has given us a gift more valuable than he intended. This proof of his true allegiances means we can interrogate him properly and learn the details of their plan." Torgrim's expression hardened into the cold determination that his enemies had learned to fear on battlefields across the northern lands. "You are suggesting we take him as a prisoner?" "I am suggesting we take him as a source of intelligence," she replied. "Carefully, quietly, and in a way that does not alert his handlers that their deception has been discovered. If we can learn the timing of their invasion and the extent of their infiltration, we might be able to turn their own strategy against them." The golden amulet lay between them like a gauntlet thrown down by fate itself, challenging them to prove themselves worthy of the trust their people had placed in them. The serpent, swallowing its own tail, seemed to mock the cycles of conquest and defeat that had shaped their world for generations. But it also suggested the possibility of breaking those cycles through wisdom and courage. "There is something else," Freydis said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something that troubles me more than Danish invasion or succession wars. This amulet's twin was taken from Jarl Eric the Serpent during the Battle of Ravensfjord. My father always suspected that Eric had escaped that battle despite reports of his death, that he had somehow survived to plot revenge against the northern clans." She met Torgrim's eyes directly, sharing a fear that had been growing in her mind since she first recognized the amulet's significance. What if Eric the Serpent is alive? What if he is the true architect of this entire conspiracy, using the succession crisis to reclaim the power that was taken from him 15 years ago? The golden amulet seemed to hiss with malevolent satisfaction at her words, as if the serpent it depicted was pleased to have its true nature finally recognized. In the chamber's firelight, husband and wife stood united in their understanding that they faced not just political crisis or foreign invasion, but the return of an enemy who had been thought dead but had instead been patiently weaving a web of revenge that now threatened to destroy everything they held. Dear, the ancient war horn that had belonged to Torgrim's grandfather now sat upon the great hall's high table, its carved surface telling the story of victories won and enemies vanquished across 3 generations of Hauksson leadership. The horn had been crafted from the tusk of a great walrus, its ivory surface polished smooth by countless hands and decorated with silver inlays that caught the light like captured lightning. When blown, its deep voice could carry across fjords and through mountain passes, summoning allies to battle or warning of approaching danger. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose entirely, as the centerpiece of the most dangerous gamble Skarnholt had ever attempted. The past 3 days had been filled with careful preparation and quiet desperation. After confronting the Danish merchant in private, Freydis and Torgrim had extracted information that confirmed their worst fears while providing them with the intelligence needed to mount a defense. Knut, whose real name was Bjorn Eriksson, son of the supposedly dead Eric the Serpent, had revealed under questioning that the Danish invasion fleet would arrive within the fortnight, coordinated with uprisings led by the 3 false claimants to Magnus's throne. The plan was brilliant in its scope and ruthless in its execution. While the northern Jarls exhausted themselves in civil war, Danish longships would land at predetermined points along the coast. The surviving claimants would then request Danish assistance to restore order, providing legal justification for the occupation of northern territories. Any Jarls who refused to submit would be eliminated as rebels against the rightful king, while those who cooperated would find themselves reduced to puppet rulers, serving Danish interests. But Bjorn's capture had given them an unexpected opportunity. The young man's failure to report back to his handlers would eventually raise suspicions, But for now, his silence bought them precious time to organize a response. More importantly, his knowledge of the invasion timeline and coordination signals provided the foundation for a counter-strategy that could turn the Danes' own deception against them. Freydis had spent the days since the revelation in intense consultation with messengers, quietly reaching out to jarls whose loyalty to the northern traditions remained unquestioned. The network of communication had to be carefully managed. Too broad and word would reach Danish agents, too narrow and they would lack the strength to resist the coming invasion. Each contact required delicate judgment about trustworthiness and capability. Jarl Magnus of the Iron Hills had been their first and most crucial ally. His territory controlled key mountain passes that could either facilitate or block Danish reinforcements, and his reputation for honorable dealing made him a natural leader for any resistance movement. When Magnus received Freydis's carefully coded message and the evidence of Danish deception, his response had been swift and decisive. The Iron Hills would stand with Skarnholt against any foreign invasion. Jarl Thorvald the Red had proven more difficult to convince, his naturally suspicious nature requiring extensive evidence before he would commit his forces to what seemed like an impossible gamble. But when Astrid's sister confirmed that the mysterious merchants had been seen in his lands as well, asking the same probing questions about defenses and loyalties, Thorvald's skepticism transformed into cold fury. No one questioned his people's loyalty without facing consequences. The hardest decision had been whether to approach Jarl Ragnar of the Eastern Cliffs, who had already received generous offers from Prince Eric's representatives. Freydis argued that Ragnar's acceptance of those offers might make him either a willing collaborator or an unwitting pawn, but either way, he posed too great a risk to include in their inner circle. Torgrim had reluctantly agreed, though the decision meant facing the invasion with one less potential ally. Now, as the sun set on what might be their last peaceful evening, the great hall filled with the careful tension of a community preparing for war, while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. The ancient war horn gleamed in the firelight, its presence a reminder of both their heritage and the terrible responsibility they had inherited as guardians of the northern way of life. Gunnar, Ironside, moved through the hall with the quiet efficiency of a man checking preparations for battle. Every weapon had been sharpened, every piece of armor inspected and repaired. The settlement's children had been discreetly relocated to the safest areas, while the women who chose to remain had been trained in the use of sayax and bow. Even Astrid the healer had insisted on learning to wield a spear, declaring that she would not tend wounds while her neighbors died for lack of defenders. The plan they had devised was complex enough to succeed, but simple enough to execute under the stress of combat. When the Danish ships appeared on the horizon, Skarnholt would appear to submit immediately, with Torgrim presenting himself as a jarl, eager to serve the victorious invaders. This apparent capitulation would allow the Danes to land without expecting resistance, while coded signals sent to their allies would coordinate a simultaneous uprising across multiple settlements. The ancient war horn would serve as the signal for the final phase of their strategy. When blown at the predetermined moment, it would alert every prepared defender within hearing distance to begin the coordinated attack that would catch the invasion. Fleet, while they were most vulnerable, spread out across multiple landing sites and confident in their deception's success. But success depended on perfect timing and flawless execution by people who had never attempted anything so complex or dangerous. One premature attack, one failure of nerve, one breakdown in communication could doom not just Skarnholt, but every settlement that had committed to the resistance. The weight of those possibilities pressed down on Torgrim like a physical burden, testing his leadership in ways that no battlefield challenge had ever done. Freydis found him standing before the war horn as the evening grew later and the hall gradually emptied of everyone except their most trusted allies. Her presence at his side had become as natural as breathing over the past weeks, their partnership evolving from political necessity to genuine dependence on each other's strengths and insights. "Are you thinking about your grandfather?" she asked quietly, following his gaze to the horn's carved surface. "I am thinking about the stories he used to tell," Torgrim replied, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of responsibility. "About the price of leadership and the cost of protecting what matters most. He used to say that any man could fight for glory, but only true leaders would fight for duty when glory was impossible to achieve." She nodded, understanding the depth of his concern. Tomorrow's battle would offer little opportunity for the kind of heroic combat that filled the songs and stories told around winter fires. Instead, it would be a contest of deception and coordination, of careful timing and desperate improvisation. Success would mean survival, while failure would mean the end of everything their ancestors had built. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you are attempting," she said with quiet conviction. "This plan requires courage of a different kind than charging into battle with sword and shield. It requires the courage to trust others completely, to risk everything on the hope that free people will choose to stand together when the moment demands it." Around them, the great hall held the accumulated memories of countless gatherings, wedding feasts and victory celebrations, somber councils and joyous homecomings. The tapestries on the walls depicted scenes of triumph and honor, while the weapons displayed there represented generations of successful defense against all who would threaten the northern way of life. Tomorrow would determine whether those traditions would continue or become merely relics of a conquered people. The ancient war horn seemed to pulse with anticipation in the firelight, its ivory surface smooth and warm from centuries of handling by leaders who had faced their own impossible challenges. Each silver inlay caught the light differently, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change, like the complex plans that would either save or doom them all. Gunnar approached them with the measured steps of a man carrying grave news. "The final scouts have returned," he reported quietly. "Danish ships have been sighted 3 days sailing to the south. They move in formation with the discipline of a coordinated fleet, not raiders seeking targets of opportunity." The confirmation of their intelligence brought no satisfaction, only the grim certainty that their preparations had been necessary and their window for action was closing rapidly. Freydis felt the silver arm ring on her wrist grow warm against her skin, as if her father's spirit was offering encouragement for the trials ahead. "Then tomorrow we discover whether wisdom and courage can triumph over treachery and overwhelming force," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. The ancient war horn waited silently on its place of honor, ready to carry its voice across the northern lands, one more time in service of the freedom that had been, purchased with the blood and sacrifice of countless generations before them. The crimson banner that flew from the Danish longship caught the morning wind like a promise of bloodshed, its golden serpent design writhing in the sunlight as the invasion fleet emerged from the sea mist. 13 ships in total, their black hulls cutting through the waves with predatory grace, while their crews prepared for what they believed would be an easy victory over divided and weakened northern settlements. The banner itself was a masterwork of intimidation, woven with threads that seemed to capture and hold the light, making the serpent appear alive and threatening even from a distance. Torgrim stood on Skarnholt's highest watchtower, his face carefully composed into an expression of resigned defeat despite the fury burning in his chest. Below him, the settlement appeared to be in chaos as people ran about in apparent panic, gathering possessions and livestock as if preparing for hasty evacuation. But the chaos was carefully orchestrated, each seemingly random movement serving to position defenders and weapons according to the plan he and Freydis had spent days perfecting. Freydis remained in the great hall, ostensibly preparing to receive the Danish commanders with appropriate submission, but actually coordinating the final elements of their deception through a network of signals and messengers that would have impressed even her strategic father. Her silver arm ring caught the light streaming through the hall's windows, its amber inlays seeming to glow with the accumulated wisdom of 12 generations of Alvhedr leaders who had faced impossible odds and found ways to prevail. The Danish fleet commander was exactly what they had expected: tall, confident, and completely convinced of his own superiority. Jarl Erik the Serpent had aged in the 15 years since his supposed death, his hair now silver-streaked and his face marked by scars that spoke of battles fought in foreign lands. But his eyes still held the cold intelligence that had made him such a dangerous enemy, and his presence aboard the lead ship confirmed every suspicion about the true nature of the succession crisis. As the ships approached the harbor, Torgrim began his performance as a defeated Jarl seeking to minimize damage to his people through quick surrender. He descended from the watchtower with appropriately heavy steps, his shoulders slumped in apparent despair, his weapons conspicuously absent from his belt. The Danish scouts who had been observing Skarnholt through the morning mist would report exactly what Erik expected to see: a settlement paralyzed by fear and ready to submit without resistance. The crimson banner snapped proudly in the wind as the lead ship entered the harbor, followed by the rest of the fleet in precise formation. Each vessel carried 40 warriors plus crew, meaning nearly 600 enemy fighters would soon be ashore and vulnerable if the coordinated attack succeeded. But the same numbers that made victory possible also guaranteed catastrophic defeat if their deception failed, or their timing proved imperfect. Erik the Serpent stepped onto Skarnholt's dock with the confident stride of a man reclaiming property that had always belonged to him. His armor was magnificent, mail shirt of the finest rings, helmet decorated with silver inlays, sword whose hilt bore gems that caught the light like captured stars. Everything about his appearance was calculated to intimidate and impress, to make clear that resistance would be futile against such obvious superiority. "Torgrim Hauksson," Erik called out in a voice that carried across the harbor despite its conversational tone. "I offer you the same choice I have offered every Jarl along this coast. Submit willingly to the rightful authority of King Olaf the Victorious, and your people will be spared the consequences of rebellion." The reference to King Olaf confirmed another element of their intelligence. One of Magnus's sons had indeed been installed as a puppet ruler, providing legal justification for the Danish occupation. Everything about the invasion had been planned with meticulous attention to political as well as military details, making it clear that Erik's 15-year exile had been spent in careful preparation rather than mere survival. Torgrim approached the dock with the measured steps of a man who had weighed his options and found them all unacceptable. His performance was flawless, shoulders slumped just enough to suggest defeat without appearing completely broken, voice carrying resignation without total surrender. "I would speak with you about terms," he said, loud enough for the Danish warriors to hear, but not so loud as to seem theatrical. Erik's smile held all the warmth of winter wind across bare stone. "Wise," he said, gesturing for his personal guard to accompany him toward the great hall. "I have always preferred negotiation to unnecessary bloodshed, especially when the outcome is inevitable." Behind them, Danish warriors began disembarking in organized groups, their discipline and equipment marking them as veteran fighters rather than mere raiders. But their very competence worked against them now, as their orderly deployment spread them across predetermined positions that would become killing grounds when the trap was finally sprung. The crimson banner continued to flutter in the morning breeze, its golden serpent seeming to mock the northern traditions it sought to destroy. But beneath that symbol of Danish arrogance, the carefully laid plans of two people who had learned to think as one began their final, deadly unfoldment. The moment of truth arrived when Erik the Serpent crossed the threshold of the great hall, his confidence absolute, and his guard perfectly positioned for the slaughter that Freydis had been planning since the moment she recognized the golden amulet's significance. The ancient war horn sat innocuously on the high table, appearing to be nothing more than a ceremonial decoration in a hall prepared for surrender negotiations. But its presence was the key to everything. When blown, it would signal the simultaneous uprising that would either free the northern lands or doom them all to slavery. Freydis stood beside the high table, with her hands folded in apparent submission, her head slightly bowed in what Eric would interpret as appropriate deference from a conquered woman. But her eyes tracked every movement of the Danish warriors as they filed into the hall, counting numbers and noting positions with the precision of someone whose life depended on perfect execution of an impossible plan. "Jarl Eric," she said with carefully modulated respect, using his title deliberately to acknowledge both his past position and his current authority. "Your reputation preceded you even into exile. My husband and I are honored by your presence." Eric's scarred face showed satisfaction at this recognition, his vanity clearly pleased by the acknowledgement that his name had retained power even in supposed death. "Your father was Alvhedr the Wise, was he not?" he asked, studying her with the calculating gaze of someone who remembered old enemies and their bloodlines. "He cost me considerable trouble during our last disagreement. I trust you have inherited his intelligence rather than his stubbornness." The threat beneath his words was unmistakable, but Freydis met his gaze steadily. "My father taught me to recognize when resistance is futile," she replied, the truth of her words carrying a meaning that Eric could not possibly understand. Resistance to his invasion was indeed futile, but resistance to his occupation would be another matter entirely. Torgrim entered the hall with his performance of defeated leadership reaching its culmination, his massive frame somehow appearing diminished despite losing none of its actual size. The psychological impact on the Danish warriors was obvious. If even the legendary Torgrim Hauksson could be broken by their leader's return, what hope did any northern jarl have of successful resistance? "Your terms?" Torgrim asked without preamble, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had already accepted inevitable defeat. Eric savored the moment, clearly enjoying the sight of his old enemies brought low before him. "Simple enough," he said, moving to examine the tapestries and weapons that decorated the hall's walls. "You will provide tribute in silver and grain, hostages to ensure continued loyalty, and warriors for King Olaf's campaigns against any jarls foolish enough to continue resisting legitimate authority." Each demand was carefully calculated to strip away not just wealth and independence, but the very foundations of northern culture. The hostages would ensure compliance through fear, while forcing northern warriors to fight against their own people would complete the psychological destruction that had begun with military conquest. But as Eric spoke, Freydis moved with seemingly casual movements that positioned her within arm's reach of the ancient war horn. Her silver arm ring caught the light as she reached for a serving cup, the amber inlays seeming to pulse with their own inner fire as the moment of decision approached. "Before we conclude these negotiations," she said, her voice taking on a different quality that made both Eric and Torgrim look at her with sudden attention, "there is one tradition that must be observed." She lifted the ancient war horn from its place on the table, holding it with both hands in a gesture that appeared ceremonial but carried deadly significance for everyone who understood its true meaning. "Among our people, agreements of such magnitude require the blessing of the ancestors. This horn has witnessed the oath-taking of 13 generations of Hauksson jarls. Surely King Olaf would not want his authority established without proper respect for the traditions that bind our people." Eric hesitated, sensing something beneath her words, but unable to identify the specific threat. His paranoia, honed by years of exile and careful planning, whispered warnings that he could not quite articulate. But his arrogance was stronger than his caution, and the idea of being honored by ancient northern traditions appealed to his sense of rightful dominance. "Proceed," he said with a dismissive gesture that would be his final mistake. Freydis raised the ancient warhorn to her lips, and in that suspended moment before sound shattered the morning quiet, she met Torgrim's eyes across the hall. What passed between them was the culmination of everything they had built together: trust, partnership, and the kind of love that emerges when two people discover they can face impossible odds as long as they face them together. The horn's voice erupted across Skarnholt like the roar of an awakening dragon, its deep note carrying across the harbour and beyond to every allied settlement within hearing distance. As its echoes rolled across the northern lands, the carefully orchestrated deception exploded into coordinated violence that would determine the fate of a civilization. The ancient war horn had spoken, and its message was war. The silence that followed the final Danish surrender was perhaps more profound than any sound that had come before. Where the morning had brought the clash of steel and the roar of battle cries, evening now offered only the gentle lapping of waves against the harbour, and the quiet conversations of people beginning to comprehend that they had survived the impossible. The carved raven bowl, once again filled with mead, but now serving as a symbol of victory rather than defiance, sat at the centre of the great hall as the northern jarls gathered to celebrate their deliverance. Eric the Serpent was dead, struck down by Torgrim's own hand when the Danish leader had finally understood the trap that had closed around him. His crimson banner now lay trampled in the mud of Skarnholt's courtyard, its golden serpent design torn and stained with the blood of those who had followed its promise of easy conquest. The invasion fleet sat captured in the harbour, their crews either dead or bound as prisoners, to be ransomed back to Denmark, along with a clear message about the price of northern aggression. Freydis stood once again before the bronze mirror in their private chamber. But now her reflection showed a woman transformed by the crucible of leadership and the fire of genuine partnership. The silver arm ring on her wrist had been joined by a golden band, her wedding ring, which Torgrim had placed there with ceremony befitting a true queen rather than a political convenience. The amber inlays in her father's ring seemed to glow with satisfaction, as if the spirits of her ancestors approved of how their wisdom had been employed. The messengers from King Olaf arrived an hour past, Torgrim said, entering the chamber with the easy confidence of a man who had proven himself in the ultimate test. He wishes to negotiate the return of his Danish allies and discuss terms for future peace between our peoples. Freydis smiled at the irony in his words. King Olaf was actually Prince Olaf, the puppet ruler who had discovered too late that his Danish handlers viewed him as expendable once their invasion failed. The prince's hasty conversion to genuine independence had been almost as swift as his earlier betrayal of northern interests, though considerably more sincere given his precarious position. And what terms do we offer this suddenly legitimate king? She asked, moving to the window that looked out over Skarnholt's rebuilt defences. The same terms we would offer any neighbour who has learned to respect our strength, Torgrim replied, coming to stand beside her. Trade rather than tribute, alliance rather than subjugation, mutual benefit rather than one-sided exploitation. The ancient war horn now occupied a place of honour above their hearth, its ivory surface polished to brilliance and its silver inlays catching the firelight like captured stars. Children would grow up hearing the story of how its voice had summoned a dozen settlements to coordinated resistance, while their parents remembered the morning when freedom itself had hung in the balance. Below them in the great hall, the celebration continued with a different quality than their wedding feast had possessed just months earlier. Now the toasts honored not just individual achievements, but collective triumph, the kind of victory that could only be won when people chose to trust each other completely. Gunnar Ironside raised his drinking horn to salute not just his jarl's prowess, but his lady's wisdom, while Astrid the healer smiled with satisfaction at seeing her early predictions about the marriage proved gloriously correct. "Do you think your father would be proud?" Torgrim asked quietly, following her gaze toward the settlement that had become the heart of northern resistance. "I think he would be amazed," Freydis replied, her voice carrying warmth and wonder in equal measure. "Not by the victory itself," He always taught me that intelligence properly applied could triumph over superior force. But by the partnership that made it possible, she turned to face him directly, her green eyes reflecting depths that had been hidden from view during their early days together. "You asked me once to help you understand what marriage should be. Now I think you know." Torgrim nodded, his understanding hard-won but complete. Two people who choose to see each other clearly, who recognize that their individual strengths become something greater when joined together, who trust each other enough to risk everything on shared purpose, and who learn that the greatest victories are not won over enemies, but alongside the person who shares your life, she added, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. The bronze mirror reflected them both now, showing not the strangers who had been bound by political necessity, but partners who had discovered that love could grow from respect, trust, and the profound satisfaction of facing impossible challenges together. The reflection showed truth without distortion, a man who had learned that strength came in many forms, and a woman who had claimed her rightful place as an equal partner in shaping their shared destiny. Outside their window, Skarnholt settled into peaceful evening routines that had been preserved through wisdom, courage, and the kind of partnership that transformed two separate people into something stronger than either could ever be alone. The settlement's children would grow up free because two people had learned to see past the limitations of their own assumptions and discover the power that emerged when respect became love and strategy became shared. Purpose, the carved raven bowl waited in the great hall below, ready to serve future celebrations and witness new triumphs that would add to the long story of northern resilience. But tonight belonged to quieter victories, the victory of understanding over ignorance, of partnership over domination, and of love that had been forged in the crucible of shared purpose and tested in the fire of mortal danger. In their private chamber, illuminated by firelight and surrounded by the symbols of their heritage and their triumph, Torgrim and Freydis held each other close and planned for a future that they would build together, one day at a time, with the wisdom of two people who had learned that the greatest strength lay not in standing alone, but in choosing to stand together.